Okay, we've got 14 people participating already. So I'm going to go ahead and just give a quick little thing about letting you guys know that we are recording this. You all came into the room muted, so we ask you to stay on mute. If you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll make sure that those get asked to our speakers. We do have the websites for both organizations that are participating today in the chat too, if you'd like to go check that out. And then I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Kylie.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm really grateful that we're all able to take the time to learn about the really important things that happened during the 2021 legislative session from two very knowledgeable and experienced organizations and leaders. We have S.J. Howell here from Montana Women Vote and Heather O'Loughlin here from the Montana Budget and Policy Center. And the reason why those two organizations are here presenting to us today is that they are grantees of the Women's Foundation of Montana. And Powerhouse is a program of the Women's Foundation of Montana. So my name is Kylie. I am the program officer for the Women's Foundation. And I'm just excited to be able to welcome you to this conversation today. So the next hour obviously is not enough time to really dig into all of the new legislation that was passed during the 2021 session, but hopefully we'll have some opportunity to hear from Hal and from Heather about the priorities that each of their organizations focused on during the session. We'll hear a little bit from them about what they think the anticipated impacts of some of the new legislation will be on communities in Montana. And hopefully a little bit about, if you're looking to get engaged with these organizations, about what opportunities there are for that. So yeah, just a reminder that we are recording. Please mute yourselves, and we will do the best we can to answer your questions during our discussion today. You can type them into the chat box and Kristen will keep an eye on them, or you can unmute yourself if there's something that is relevant to what one of our speakers is talking about. And you can just ask for clarification or context as we're having the conversation. So let me introduce our speakers. So I'll start with Howell, who's the Executive Director of Montana Women Vote. Howell joined Montana Women Vote in December of 2011. And over the last decade, which I'm sure has seemed really more like 3 decades, Howell has worked on 2 successful campaigns to pass Medicaid expansion, managed multiple cycles of civic engagement with low-income women, and served on ballot initiative campaign committees on several diverse issues. Before coming to Montana Women Vote, Howell worked as a field organizer, at Western State Center, which is a regional social justice nonprofit based in Portland. And while not working, I know that Howell brings their community organizer skills to outdoor recreation, to enjoying a stiff drink, whiskey specifically, and to being a fantastic parent. So thanks for being with us, Howell. And Heather is the co-director of the Montana Budget and Policy Center, focusing on research and policy analysis and helping produce research on the impact of tax and budget policies on the lives of Montana families. So really breaking down some wonky stuff for Montanans. Heather has served as the legislative director and counsel for Senator Max Baucus, managing the senator's legislative team. And previously, she served as the legislative assistant to Senator Baucus, handling a policy portfolio that included education, judiciary, banking, and economic issues. She received her Juris Doctorate from the University of Montana School of Law and bachelor's degree in business finance and economics from the University of Montana. Heather originally is from Great Falls and now lives in Helena with her husband and her daughter. So thanks for joining us, Heather. I'm just so grateful that you guys are here to share your expertise and your experience, and hopefully it's not re-traumatizing to share what happened during the session, but we're grateful. So Heather, I'm going to toss it to you to have you kick us off and just share with us a little bit about Montana Budget and Policy Center. Who does your organization engage? What sort of big picture issues are you looking at, and what kind of change are you hoping to create in Montana?
Great. Well, thank you, Kylie, and thank you to the Women's Foundation for having us. So Montana Budget and Policy Center, we're about 10 years old. And as Kylie mentioned, we focus primarily on research and advancing policies focused on tax and budget policies to improve the lives of Montanans who are living on lower and moderate incomes. That's very broad. And so we work on a lot of different topics. We have worked on, healthcare policy with Medicaid expansion. We track a lot of what happens with the state budget through the legislative process. And then we also work on tax policy and just looking at how our taxes are impacting both lower income families, but also our ability to invest in our state budget. We work with a variety of groups. So we're not a membership organization, but really partner with groups like Montana Women Vote to help provide data and analysis that they can then turn around and use as they're talking with their members and with voters and policymakers. We have a broader fiscal coalition that is called the Partnership for Montana's Future. And there's a few folks on this call that have been engaged in that coalition over the years to really sort of work collaboratively around building a strong budget that invests in communities and in Montanans and families. So that's a little bit of background on what we do, and happy to talk about some of the work this session we did too.
Great, thanks, Heather. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of the work this session, which we definitely will do, how will you tell us a little bit about Montana Women Vote, who you engage, what issues you work on, and what kind of change you're hoping to create in the state?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having us here. Always happy to participate. So Montana Women Vote is about 20 years old, an organization that really started as a very grassroots community level voter engagement project, and has really grown to be an organization that engages low-income women and families in a variety of policy and organizing ways. We're an economic justice organization like MBPC, so we really think about the policies that create and perpetuate poverty, but we come at that from a specific angle, and that angle really has to do with gender. So we think about how poverty impacts women, children, LGBTQ folks, and families uniquely, and how policies that address poverty and economic inequity can also be specifically tailored to address the needs of women and trans non-binary folks and families. Our work, we do three main types of work. One is community organizing. So that includes everything from registering voters outside the grocery store to having conversations with our members and low-income folks across the state about issues that impact their lives. The second type of work is policy advocacy. So this happens mostly during the legislative session, or I should say at the state legislative level. It happens all year round. Looking at how we can create and change policy to impact the lives of low-income Montanans. And then thirdly, leadership development. So this is everything from our annual conference, the Women's Policy Leadership Institute, to just creating spaces for our members to be involved in decision-making processes that impact their lives. So that's the medium length answer about Montana Women Vote.
And I think also, Hal, it might be nice to have you share a little bit about what that engagement looked like during the 2021 session. So the legislature clearly decided to move forward with an in-person session in the middle of a pandemic. And as an organization that's looking to directly engage, Montanans in the legislative process, what did that engagement look like? How do you think the legislature adapted, and how do you think communities were actually able to participate?
Well, as everybody know, we had sort of a mixed bag in terms of accessibility during the session. On the one hand, for the first time ever in Montana legislative history, folks were able to participate in committee hearings by Zoom, and testify remotely. And I do think that that made a big difference for folks who aren't able to travel, take off work, find childcare, etc. And I will say that because the Zoom option existed alongside a sort of business as usual in-person session that was running inside the building, it was sort of complicated. It often felt that there were sort of two tiers of engagement in some of the committee hearings where there was a lot of interest. Folks in the room went first, and if there wasn't enough time, folks online, didn't get a chance to testify. There were, often challenges with being able to sort of fully share one's story and perspective over Zoom. So it wasn't a perfect solution. For us, I think that especially the first few months of the session, there were real safety concerns. There were people in the building who were getting sick, and information about those contacts was hard to come by if you weren't a legislator. So we encouraged people to participate remotely if that was what was safest and best for their health and the health of their families and communities. And I think that we did have a lot of folks participate for the first time over Zoom. So like I said, sort of a mixed bag. I'm interested to see what will happen next session. The one bright spot that I will say is that the ability to watch what's happening online, that existed pre-COVID. We've always had the legislative session streaming online one way or another. And I think many, many more people chose to watch and see what was happening and listen in and try to learn a little bit about the issues they cared about. So I'm excited to leverage that in the future for more people feeling like they can understand the process and follow their top issues.
Yeah, thanks. And if people did end up streaming some lovely committee hearings or end up testifying remotely yourself, if you want to throw in the chat what issues you were tracking that way or what you testified on, that would be lovely to hear about. And Heather, I'll kick it back to you to share a little bit with us about what Montana Budget and Policy Center's top priorities were going into the session. What opportunities were you hoping to see manifest in the session? And maybe what were you worried about as far as harmful legislation? What were you keeping an eye on going into it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that I think many organizations pivoted more to defensive work than they had in the past. Again, as I think really kind of one of the lead progressive organizations that works on tax policy, we knew that a big portion of the work that we were going to do this session was related to proposals to cut taxes. So Governor Gianforte had a series of proposals reflected in his budget to cut taxes. And then we saw myriad of other proposals throughout the legislative session by legislators. I think we totaled about 25 bills that proposed to cut taxes in a variety of ways. And so we spent a fair amount of time on the defensive side, just elevating what the potential impact of those bills would be, both again, from the standpoint of like who ultimately benefited from those proposals, and also the cost, the long-term cost that the state would experience from the loss of that revenue. We had a lot of help in that work. So some really incredible work across organizations that really linked the need to continue to maintain revenue levels so that we can invest in things like mental health services, early childhood education, a variety of topics, food assistance, those types of things that many of our partners are really focused on. And so I think I would just say that we saw organizations who haven't traditionally engaged on tax policy and haven't often been in tax committee there really pushing to ensure that we maintain our revenue. We had, it was a difficult session, and I think we had some successes in beating back some of the bills that I think would have severely cut revenue. But the reality is we were up against a lot when this was really one of the governor's top priorities. So, about half of those bills ultimately passed. Some of them were amended to reduce the ultimate cost. But in total, we estimate that the state will experience about $100 million in lost revenue each biennium, so every 2-year period. There are some bills that did pass that will raise new revenues, so there's a net, a smaller amount that is the net of those things. But the reality is we will see less revenue moving forward, and I think that will make for a challenging budget sessions into the future. We'll see how all of those play out. I think, one that we really focused on, there were a couple bigger bills, one to cut the top income tax bracket, Senate Bill 159, that lowered the top tax rate from 6.9% to 6.75%. There's another bill that will phase in 2 years later that will again drop that rate to 6.5%. The lion's share of that tax cut goes to wealthy households that have more income in that top bracket. And so we estimate that about 80% of the tax reduction will go to the wealthiest 20% of households in Montana. So, we have grave concerns about what that will ultimately cost the state. And I think we'll be tracking, who ultimately is benefiting, from that legislation. There are some other bills that, set up different tax benefits for businesses or entrepreneurs. And I think we don't know the full cost of those at this point, but I think it's something that we'll continue to track in the interim and into the next session, and hopefully be able to, pare back some of these tax cuts. I think the good news is that, a lot of work happened both inside the Capitol, but a lot of it outside the Capitol, that I think people really recognized that the level of tax cuts that were initially being proposed would have severely undercut our ability to invest in education, in health services. And we heard from Montanans across the state. It was interesting because I think people are somewhat familiar with what had happened in Kansas over the last decade, when former Governor Brownback really severely cut taxes, and what that meant to the state. they are still slowly clawing their way out of that situation. And so I think it was really powerful to have people talking to their legislators and highlighting it in the press, and that, you know, we do not want to go down the path of Kansas. And so I think that was helpful in pushing back on some of the worst pieces of legislation that we saw. But, you know, it was a difficult climate for sure for the tax policy space.
And I think that's a testament to Montana Budget and Policy Center's work in making, I mean, that so many more organizations and more community members showed up to voice their concern about that. I know that taxes can often feel like an alienating policy subject to engage on. So it's good that there was that response, and that you were there to support with the data and analysis Montanans' ability to voice their concerns. Hal, I know that Montana Women Vote also, because you and Montana Budget and Policy Center work so closely together, you might have tracked some of the same things that Heather just mentioned. But if you want to add more to what she said, or talk about other policy priorities that Montana Women Vote had, that would be great.
Sure. Well, you know, like Heather said, the state budget and the policies that raise revenue in the state are, you know, really pretty fundamental to every issue area that we work on. And so I won't add a lot to Heather's analysis. I think she covered it well, but I will say that the budget and revenue really are linked to everything that we worked on. You know, we too had a defensive stance going into the session. Understandably, one of the big issues that we were concerned about was healthcare, and specifically, you know, cuts to Medicaid, to CHIP and Healthy Montana Kids, both cuts in terms of, you know, potential cuts to eligibility, potential cuts to benefits, and of course, potential cuts in the budget. And, you know, in this area, we did see a couple pretty terrible bills. SB 100, which was known as the Welfare Fraud Prevention Bill. You know, that bill was introduced in, I think, the third week of the session, and hung around all the way until the second to last week of the session. That bill would have created many more steps to becoming eligible for a variety of safety net services, including Medicaid and CHIP and Healthy Montana Kids, as well as SNAP. And those, you know, those eligibility steps, while they were proposed as a means to eliminate fraud, which we all know is virtually non-existent in these programs already, what they would have done is made the programs inaccessible to many Montanans who are eligible for them. We were fortunate to kill that bill and another bill, HB 676, which was similarly looking to change eligibility and some other determinations around Medicaid and CHIP. So that was a success. We did see, though, a change to Medicaid through the ending of continuous eligibility. And continuous eligibility is basically a policy that says when you are determined to be eligible for Medicaid, you remain eligible for a year, a calendar year. And that continuous eligibility is really important to people's ability to actually use their healthcare coverage to you know, establish a relationship with a primary care doctor, to get access to things like prescriptions or ongoing mental health care, things like that. And that change, that policy has previously not existed in statute, in law, but rather in the rules that were created in the Department of Public Health and Human Services around Medicaid. And so the change was easy enough for the state to make. It came in the budget. And so now the sort of end of continuous eligibility does exist in statute. And there was a chunk of money taken out of the budget to reflect not providing that eligibility for people on Medicaid. Beyond that, there were several other attacks on safety net programs. These are things that we often have seen, year after year, session after session. And again, we were, I think, fairly successful in defeating most of the worst of those bills. We had a lot of help with that. There was a big coalition working on all of these safety net bills, and a lot of really smart, hardworking folks, both in their communities and in the building. I do want to just mention a couple other issue areas. One of the issues that we worked on a fair amount was Indigenous justice, and specifically looking at continuing on and continuing investment in programs designed to address the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis. And there was that effort was relatively successful. There were 4 bills that were designed to continue on programs that had been started that were passed in 2019, and some additional investment in those programs, and those all passed. We did see, once again, there were bills to create Indigenous Peoples Day in the state. Those bills failed. There were also a number of attacks on tribal sovereignty, both in terms of land use and in terms of tax policy. Some of those were defeated. One tax policy bill was passed. So some success in Indigenous justice, although not as much as we would have liked. And, similarly, there were a number of bills in the criminal legal reform realm that were aimed at building on a lot of really good work in the past 3 or 4 sessions, and a lot of success in starting to move the state toward a more just criminal legal system. Some of that work moved forward. A number of the bills that we supported either started as or were turned into study bills, which means that the work is going to be taken up by an interim committee in the next 18 months. And so that conversation will be ongoing. And then, of course, I know folks probably watched the attacks on reproductive health access, the attacks on trans non-binary individuals, especially trans youth, and the attacks on voting rights. And I'm happy to go into more detail on any of those if folks want, but I'll stop here so as not to overwhelm with bad news all at once.
Thanks, Howell. Yeah, if folks have specific questions about any of the policy areas that Howell mentioned, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I wonder if Heather or Howell, I'll throw it to either one of you. If you want to talk about some of, you mentioned a little bit what some of the immediate impacts were of both the attacks on social safety net as well as some of the tax cuts. But I wonder if you want to just provide some thoughts on what the longer term impacts of sort of the way that we saw the state legislature turn a little bit this year. If your organizations have thought, what does this look like 2 or 3 sessions from now, or even farther down the road?
Heather, do you want to start with that, or do you want me to take a stab?
Well, why don't you start?
Well, truthfully, Heather should be starting, because I think the clearest answer that I can give about long-term impact has to do with the tax cuts. The truth is that it's difficult to think about the work we have ahead of us to roll back a lot of these bad policies, but the tax cut policy in particular feels very troubling. The potential for us to roll back some of these tax cuts and reinstate some of the tax brackets that have been dropped or eliminated, that is a long-term effort. It's an effort that we've been working on for years now, and certainly that work will continue. But in the meantime, we are going to see millions, hundreds of millions of dollars left on the table. And we are not feeling the impact of that in this year's budget, but we will certainly feel the impact of that in the next biennium's budget and all the budgets after that. And I think that it is extremely concerning to me to think, 4 years from now, how do we fill a $50 million hole in our budget? Because historically, the answer has been on the backs of low-income Montanans by cutting services and programs that Montanans across the state rely on. So I think that when we think about the programs that have worked really well for Montanans, programs like Medicaid, programs like CHIP and SNAP, programs that support Montanans with disabilities, the long-term impacts, I think that we need to prepare for are really drastic cuts to those programs. And I'll just mention, we had a round of pretty serious budget cuts in 2017. Many of those programs have not fully recovered from those cuts. So, for me, that's of top concern. I think also we are going to see many lawsuits in the next 18 months that will further demonstrate, the impact of this session. I feel cautiously optimistic that, a lot of the attacks on reproductive access, for example, we'll see those struck down in the courts thanks to a really strong state constitution. But I think that the long-term impact of passing policy and then spending years litigating it is both that it's costly to the state and to organizations who have to engage in that legal advocacy. And it means that, a lot of our policies are sort of up in the air or in flux for years and years, and that's really hard on communities as well. Heather, I'll stop there, and why don't you jump in? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how things play out. And this is sort of jumping a little ahead in your questions, Kylie, about just sort of what to expect in the coming year. But, we see some pretty positive things happening on a federal level as far as injecting some additional federal dollars into the state that I think we'll see buffer a little bit of that, the potential loss of state revenue. We've got some federal dollars coming in to support, childcare infrastructure, a number of different funding streams. I think it will be a question of what do things look like, 2 to 3 years out when those federal dollars are gone. And I do think we are in definitely a more difficult place in thinking strategically about what are the types of investments we need to make. I'll just say, Hal's point about what we experienced in 2017 with budget cuts, what we heard throughout session is just an absolute dire situation in many communities and accessing health services, particularly behavioral health services, where you saw a lot of these service providers get hit in 2017. And we are certainly not where we were before that. And even before that, we had a pretty difficult system, right? So I think that is something that, we continue to hear the need for additional investments, and whether or not that's going to be possible, I think is a big question. Childcare and early childhood education is also a place where we've actually we've moved backward over the last couple sessions, and again, we will see a pretty significant influx in federal dollars, and how those dollars are going to be used is a big question. But what happens after that, right? And really setting up the need to continue those types of investments, with state resources. So I think that's, I think Hell's absolutely right. That I think is really one of the big challenges that we face. We saw legislators come in not necessarily thoughtfully prioritizing what they wanted to do. So I think organizations that are advocating for families and communities were hit with a lot of different issues. I'm hopeful that 2023 session will be in a different position, right, to defend and protect communities, and also, I think the landscape may have shifted, but there's no question that this session, there were a lot of really bad things that passed that I think we're now going to have to spend some effort either paring back or finding other ways to protect people.
Yeah, it's hard to think about, the job of the legislators is really to bolster and create systems so our communities and our families can thrive, and we can take care of ourselves. And so much of, particularly in the middle of a global pandemic, so much of that support was really chipped away at. So thank you for being there, for doing the work that you did to try to keep those systems in place during that. And I want to just, we've got a good 20 minutes left, and I want to take an opportunity and open it up to people. If there are questions about specific legislation that was brought up in the last half hour or so, or things that you are interested in learning more about and what the impact of those things might be on Montana's communities, I just want to pause for a minute and see if there are questions from folks who've joined us today.
Kylie, this is Jan Stroud. I was just writing my question. Would it be okay to say it?
Absolutely, go for it, Jan.
Sorry, just takes me a little while. And I just wanted to say thank you so much to the speakers for fighting the good fight and working under just the most challenging circumstances I think many of us have ever seen or faced. I just want to acknowledge how important your work and the resources of both groups. I also wondered, in a nonpartisan way, how we're looking at the elected landscape between now and 2022, as well as the policy landscape, hoping there are both opportunities as well as continued defense.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, so for us at Montana Budget and Policy Center, I mean, we're sort of spending a couple months to sort of reflect on where we sit today and what are the things that we want to elevate. I think we have some thoughts and ideas of how to engage organizations and voters on like what happened this session, and really educating them on how policy decisions may impact their day-to-day life. So I don't know that I have a clear sense of like what are the things, right, that we want to elevate. I will put a plug in, and I meant to include this earlier. We've worked with Montana Women Vote and a number of organizations on caregiving, the needs of caregivers, and particularly a policy to establish a statewide paid family medical leave insurance program, which I think there's continues to be opportunity to talk about that. That legislation has died in committee, but we've had bipartisan support in the past, and I think both in recognition of caregiving needs of children, but also caregiving needs of adult family members. We have positive conversations with legislators on that, as well as paid sick days, I think is another item that we've talked about as well. And so I think there are things that really resonate with families, that they understand that this directly impacts them, that we can continue. And we always like to do both proactive work, even if we're up against defensive, a lot of defensive work, because I think it gives us the opportunity to engage Montanans with here's what we could see, right? And here's what's out there and what's possible. So I think there's definitely opportunity for that. The political landscape, as you said, we are a C3, and so we're not engaged in the electoral side, but we're obviously, waiting to see sort of what we could expect. Engaging legislators on both sides of the aisle has always been important in Montana, but certainly hopeful that we have, different dynamics that could make this work a little easier.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Heather said. I'll just add a couple thoughts. I think that one thing that's happening in the political landscape right now that's pretty important for the next decade is the redistricting process that followed the 2020 census. And we're actually, Montana has a pretty good, bipartisan redistricting commission that has historically done a good job of creating a districting setup that works for most Montanans. I'll say that the redistricting commission is in a process right now where they are deciding on a set of criteria that they will use to draw up districts. And by that, mostly I mean state legislative districts, although again, we are carving out a new congressional district, and that's exciting as well. The redistricting commission has essentially two sets of proposals on those criteria, and one is a Democratic proposal and one is a Republican proposal. I'll just say, in a nonpartisan fashion, there are some real differences between those proposals. I encourage folks to look into that, and public comment is open now and will be open for another few weeks. And there's a meeting in early July, a public comment forum in early July. We will be putting out more information on how folks can get involved on our website and through our member emails, so you can watch out for that. There's also a lot of other good organizations sharing information on redistricting. So I think that's one area that folks can get involved in. And I think that, just to sort of reiterate what Heather said, I think part of the work we have ahead of us is to have the conversation with folks across the state about sort of what the role of government is. I think one of the really challenging things that came out of 2020 and this legislative session was the sense that because of the COVID pandemic, that government was working against us. And, I don't share that sentiment. I know a lot of other folks don't either, but I do think that we have a little bit of work to do to talk about, what do we mean when we say invest in communities? Where do our taxes go? Why do we care about this? How does it actually impact our lives? And I think the more that we can have those conversations and tie them to real policies that the legislature grapples with every 2 years, the better off we'll be in the long term. And then, Heather, I think that you should take this ARPA question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a big piece of sort of what's next for us in this interim. So ARPA stands for the American Rescue Plan Act, which Biden signed really kind of in the middle of our state legislative session. The legislature appropriated those funds. It's roughly about $3 billion that will come to Montana in a variety of funding streams. They appropriated those funds to state agencies and then established commissions to review recommendations by those agencies on how exactly to use those funds. I'm going to drop in the chat box. I just put together kind of just a really quick and dirty summary in like a PowerPoint that talks a little bit about each of those commissions and what they have jurisdiction over. And then the state has set up a website. Before I type it out, I should make sure that I have the right. Yeah, okay, that's right. A website that you can go to and see how each of those commissions, when they're meeting. Not a lot of decisions have been made at this point. Some of the funds are pretty specific. So there's funding that goes to the Department of Health and Human Services for, vaccinations, testing. There's some buckets of funding that are really designed to help expand social safety net programs like SNAP and food assistance, home and community-based services. And so some of that is a bit prescriptive on how the money can be used. There is, however, a pretty big pot of money, roughly about $1 billion that the state is receiving as state fiscal recovery funds. Those funds, they have some parameters on how they can be used, but the guidance from the federal government is actually, pretty broad in some of the ways that this can be used. So I definitely encourage folks that would like to sort of see more about what these commissions have in front of them to take a look at that. There's a couple different places that we at Montana Budget and Policy Center are looking. One, we did put out through Montana Kids Count recommendations for how to utilize funding that is focused on childcare. So really thinking about targeting those funds to areas that are underserved and helping to build capacity for childcare slots and really with an eye towards quality. So we are receiving about $100 million in federal funds for childcare money, and that it presents a lot of opportunities, I think, for the state to be really forward thinking and how they can potentially use those funds to help set us up for a better childcare system after this. The other place that I think we're hoping to weigh in is on some of that more flexible money, really thinking about the housing constraints that we are experiencing across the state. There is some additional support for housing assistance and rental assistance, but the reality is that we have a supply issue, right? And the state can, and we think should, really invest some of those flexible dollars in helping to support the construction and preservation of affordable housing across the state. It is not on a list at this point. So far, those flexible funds the conversations have been really about supporting businesses and, talking about particular industries that have been impacted by COVID. We think that housing, both low income housing, but also workforce housing is a huge, huge issue. And so I think that's an area that we hope to also, elevate as a potential use of those funds. So yeah, I think there's a lot of unknowns at this point on how those funds will be used. These commissions will meet throughout the summer and probably the fall. And so I think it's definitely worth continuing to check that state website on, what recommendations they're seeing from state agencies as well.
Great, thanks, Heather. So we probably have one more question, time for one more question. If anybody has one they want to throw out in the chat box, or unmute yourself and ask. I do have one follow-up. I know that, I don't know if it's premature to start talking about this, but we did have a ballot initiative that came out of the session. How would you like to talk about that and let people know when to expect to start hearing about that, and sort of what your thoughts are on, as Montanans, how we should prepare ourselves for that conversation?
Sure, yes. So there were actually a couple of legislative referendums, so issues placed on the ballot by the legislature. One in particular that's really egregious. It's what's called, emphasis on the air quotes, the Born Alive referendum. And this is a piece of policy addressing the very rare instances of late-term abortion. I think, folks know that these procedures are exceptionally rare and happen really in only the sort of worst case scenarios of fetal anomalies or severe risk to the mother. And I think, policy wise, the policy being put on the ballot won't actually change anything. It won't impact how these procedures happen or whether or not they're accessible to pregnant folks. That it won't really do anything. What it does do is create a political conversation around next year's election, and a conversation that, for any family that's dealt with this sort of situation is sort of horrific and traumatizing. And for a lot of other folks, it's a conversation based in a lot of misinformation and sort of intentional misdirection. So all of that being said, I think that there are some very smart people out there doing the sort of legal due diligence to make sure that if there is a way to keep this off the ballot, we can do that work. But I think that we should plan for this to appear on the ballot. And I think it's not settled, as far as I know, how the best way to approach this conversation. But I think that we do have to anticipate that there'll be a fair amount of work to be done to talk about what that referendum is and isn't, and what it means for Montanans. I will also just say there are a pretty long list of proposed citizens initiatives that are already being filed. So, it is too early to qualify anything for the ballot yet, but that process will start soon. So, we'll start seeing signature gatherers out before too long. And I suspect that we will see a broad variety of issues on the ballot next year. And this is both, a challenge and an opportunity. It's always, I think, really useful to talk to voters about their opportunity to vote directly on an issue that impacts their lives. But it's also a lot of work to make sure that voters have the information they need to make an informed choice on initiatives. And especially when we see, 5, 6, 8 initiatives on a single ballot, the way we have in the past on occasion. there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that everybody has that information. So, a lot still to be determined in how we deal with the referenda and other initiatives. But I think it's going to be a really difficult and important conversation moving forward.
Thanks for explaining that to us, Howell. So I think the opportunities to engage with policy that were described are some of the ARPA committee meetings that are meeting through the summer and the fall, interim committee meetings at the legislature, which you can stream. I believe you can stream all of the interim committee meetings if you'd like, if you're interested in spending your time streaming those meetings, but also keeping an eye out for ballot initiatives and citizen initiatives that are coming up. And I just appreciate both of you for helping us think, like, what does helping our neighbors think about what investment in Montana's communities and infrastructure for things like childcare and healthcare actually look like? Like, what could we do with the ARPA money that really sustains our communities and reinvest that rather than just a one-time spending opportunity for impacted industries? But how could we think longer term about those opportunities, and what could we envision when we think about families and communities in Montana being more supported on the daily and also through massive events like the pandemic that we just went through? Are there any specific opportunities that either of you want to mention with your organizations for ways for people to get plugged in if they're interested?
Well, we are just starting to get back into some in-person events and volunteer opportunities as our folks, get vaccinated and feel safe coming together again. So, signing up for our email list is the best way, or following us on social medias is the best way to know about those events. We are going to be continuing a series of community gatherings to talk about all of this sort of stuff, and are getting back into our voter registration and community outreach work. And we always love to have volunteers engage in that with us. And then, along with MBPC and a lot of other organizations, we are going to be engaging in a variety of interim committee work through the session. And there are opportunities to testify, to give public comment during that work. And so again, be in touch with me directly or sign up for our emails. Love to get folks plugged in.
Yeah, and we have a newsletter, e-newsletter that we send out, and so I'll drop that in the chat. If folks are interested, please feel free to sign up. We don't send it out as regularly during the summer, but we do hope to provide updates on the reports that we're releasing and upcoming interim committees through this, and so would love to have you sign up for that.
Well, thank you, Howell and Heather, for sharing your experience and your expertise with us today, and helping us make sense of what happened during the session and what's to come. We really appreciate it. And to folks who joined us, we'll be updating you on the work of Montana Women Vote and Montana Budget and Policy Center going forward. So keep reading the newsletter, and thank you all again for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.